Somewhere in a diesel shop in the early 1970s, a mechanic pulled the inspection covers off a 20-cylinder engine and found the crankshaft cracked. Not worn, not fatigued after 1 million hard miles. Cracked, sitting inside the locomotive that was supposed to be the future of American railroading. That engine made 3,600 horsepower, the most powerful machine EMD would put on 6 axles. And the railroads, the people who had every reason in the world to want more power, kept turning around and ordering the weaker machine instead. 3,000 horsepower, 16 cylinders. Less of nearly everything the sales sheet bragged about. For years, that looked like nerve failure. It was the opposite. It was the smartest bet anyone in the industry made, and it built a locomotive they have spent the last 50 years refusing to let die. The 1960s had turned into a horsepower arms race. Every builder wanted the biggest number on the spec sheet, and more cylinders looked like the obvious path to more power. EMD chased it too. But somewhere in that chase, the company stumbled into a lesson the rest of the industry would pay full price to learn. The reason starts with a piece of physics the brochures never mentioned. When a heavy train is starting to roll, the limit isn't horsepower. It's grip, how much weight is sitting on the driving wheels and how well steel holds steel. Down low, where the tonnage actually fights you, that extra 600 horsepower has nowhere to go. You can't feed it to the rail. The bigger engine's advantage only woke up at higher speeds, and a lot of heavy freight spends its whole life never getting there. Here's where most people tell the story wrong. The usual line is that the bigger engine drank too much fuel. It didn't. Measured against the work it did, the 20-cylinder was actually a touch more efficient. What broke it was the block itself. 20 cylinders meant a longer engine, and that longer block flexed under load, and the flexing worked its way straight into the crankshaft until the metal gave up. And a cracked crankshaft is not a roadside repair. It means the engine pulled from the frame, the locomotive dead in a shop for weeks, and a bill big enough to swallow whatever that extra power ever earned. Put that next to a higher price to buy and a higher price to maintain, and the math turned ugly in a hurry. But raw power was never the thing that made this locomotive immortal. Iron alone doesn't earn that. What earned it was something almost nobody outside a repair shop ever laid eyes on. The improved version, the one railroaders just call the -2, wasn't really about pulling harder. The real change was buried in the electrical guts. The old machines ran on a sprawling tangle of wiring, and when a fault showed up, a crew might spend half the night chasing it down 100 feet of harness. The new design swapped that for solid-state control modules, plug-in cards. Something acts up, you pull the bad card, slide in a fresh one, and the locomotive goes back to work. These weren't computers. There wasn't a microprocessor anywhere in them, just clean, replaceable electronics. The builder claimed reliability climbed around 15% over what came before. That is the unglamorous secret under the whole legend. A locomotive a worn-out crew can fix in the dark at 2 in the morning is a locomotive that never comes off the roster. Durability was never only about the castings and the steel. It was about how fast you could put the thing back into service. And the timing could not have looked worse. This machine arrived just as the industry around it was falling apart. Penn Central, the single biggest railroad in the country, went bankrupt in June of 1970. Rock Island went under a few years later. The Milwaukee Road followed it down. Entire networks were dying where they stood. In that kind of collapse, a bulletproof locomotive built from common standardized parts stopped being a luxury and became survival gear. Nobody could afford a fragile fleet. Nobody could afford a backroom full of parts bins that only fit one model. You needed something that ran, kept running, and could be brought back to life with whatever happened to be on the shelf. It started slow, fewer than 350 of them a year at first. Then, two things landed at once. The coal boom of the late 70s sent demand for heavy haulers through the roof, And in 1980, the Staggers Act tore up decades of railroad regulation in a single stroke. For the first time in living memory, railroads could run like real businesses, chasing coal and intermodal freight almost nobody had seen coming. Reliable, standardized power didn't just become the smart choice, it became the only safe place left to put your money, and then the whole thing nearly got killed before it could prove a single point. The locomotive rode on a new truck. The assembly underneath that carries the axles and drives the power down into the rail. It was a high-traction design, and it had a passenger-hauling cousin that started doing something genuinely frightening. At speed, on certain stretches of track, those passenger units began jumping the rails. These were not minor incidents. A high-speed derailment with passengers aboard is the kind of thing that ends careers and reputations, and the whole industry was watching. Over a couple of years, federal investigators logged more than a dozen separate derailments. The first suspect was the truck. Investigators argued the new high-traction design went unstable at high speed, and the fear cut so deep that one of the largest railroads in the country, Conrail, ordered its freight units built with the old truck instead. They spec'd the signature piece of the machine right out of it rather than take the risk. It was an extraordinary vote of no confidence, a major railroad deciding that the single feature built to define this locomotive was safer left off of it. Then the builder and the federal investigators ran the problem to ground together, and the truck was cleared. The derailments traced back to something else entirely, a mix of light baggage cars riding at the tail end of those trains, water sloshing inside the steam generator tanks, and in some places, rough track underneath. The truck half the industry had been ready to condemn went on to one of the cleanest safety records in the business, holding up under heavy six-axle power for decade after decade. By then, the railroads had quietly stopped thinking of these locomotives as equipment and started treating them as an investment they refused to write off. When the frames got old, they didn't scrap them. They rebuilt them. A new locomotive costs a fortune. Rebuilding a frame the railroad already owns costs a fraction of that, and it rolls back out hauling the same tonnage it always did. Union Pacific alone took 486 of theirs and rebuilt them with modern microprocessor controls, the computers the originals never had, and turned them right back out onto the road. CSX, Norfolk Southern, and others ran rebuild programs of their own. 50-year-old machines, born into a dying industry, kept earning second and third lives, simply because nothing newer was worth buying to take their place. There's one rebuild that tells the whole story by itself. On a small batch of them, the railroads pulled the original engine out completely and dropped in a brand new prime mover built by General Electric, the company that had spent years clawing at EMD for the locomotive market, and that eventually won it outright. A fresh competitor's engine bolted into the bones of EMD's masterpiece, because the old frame was still worth more than anything new you could put under it. It was never a large program. It never needed to be. The point was only that it could be done at all, which leaves the oldest one of all. Before any of it, before the scandal, before Staggers, before the legend, there was a single test unit. EMD built it in July of 1964 on a borrowed frame just to find out whether the design would run. It was the first of the entire family, the machine the rest of them grew straight out of. Over the years, the crews kept rebuilding it and bringing it up to the newer standard, and it simply kept earning its keep. It hauled freight for a living, until a Canadian railroad finally pulled it off the roster in March of 2009. 45 years. The first one they ever built ran for 45 years.